Bob is gonna run 10 miles and do a bunch of resistance training. Thomas is gonna fast for 2 days. Is one going to have a better result? Is one going to have a better result over a lifetime if they did this once per week? That's what we're gonna try to figure out. I've got Dr. Kyle Gillett here, who's an awesome resource in this entire world of weight loss. He's a board certified physician in family practice as well as obesity medicine. So we want to talk about this exercise versus fasting thing, because in academia we're seeing this a lot, where exercise compared to fasting, compared to placebo, and the results are quite intriguing and not what you would really expect. So let's start with sort of the elephant in the room. Like, what are we seeing there?
I popped a link down below for my favorite macadamia nuts from a company called House of Macadamias. Seriously the best. Okay, their onion flavor is unbelievable, but they also have macadamia nut bars that the first ingredient is literally macadamia nuts. So you're talking a bar that is predominantly macadamia nuts, and it tastes like a candy bar. It's sweetened with, it doesn't have any sugar in it at all, so you're not gonna have this crazy insulin spike, and you can get good, healthy calories in, keep your calories where they need to be, while maintaining insulin sensitivity potentially. Okay, so I popped a link down below that'll save you 20% off whatever you want from House of Macadamia, whether it's straight up macadamia nuts, whether it's the macadamia nut bars, whether it's their revolutionary new macadamia nut oil. They're also giving anyone that makes a purchase through my link a free 20-ounce bottle of cold pressed macadamia nut oil. So literally getting a full bottle of macadamia nut oil with any purchase when you use that 20% off discount link.
Yeah, so there's a big debate about whether or not exercise is even useful for weight loss, or whether or not fasting is useful for weight loss. And there is a ton of clinical literature published, and you can, depending on the size of the study, you can basically find whatever you want. But the aggregation of the high quality studies and the high quality evidence shows that neither exercise nor fasting or time restricted feeding, and this is somewhat surprising, neither one helps with weight loss. However, it very likely does impact body composition changes, and it helps with weight maintenance, and there are many uses of them for health reasons. For example, if you compare the two people, if you added a third person that did neither the fasting and neither the exercise, they're very sedentary and we're just on a very low calorie diet, that person's at much higher risk of weight regain, much higher risk of insulin resistance, probably at higher risk of maintaining just as severe fatty liver disease if it's present.
Interesting. Okay, so with what we're looking at here, I mean, they're looking at just sheer weight loss. They're not looking at body fat changes. They're not looking at muscle recomposition. Are they looking at any other biomarkers, or is it just straight up weight loss?
Yeah, the primary outcome is weight loss of these studies. Okay. There's usually secondary outcomes, but as many scientists and clinicians know, you should be very dubious about making a conclusion from a secondary outcome, because it's not what the study's designed to do. Like the confounders, you account for confounding variables, which is basically unforeseen things that are gonna affect the results for the primary outcome, not necessarily for the secondary outcome. That being said, that's kind of one of the reasons why, I don't know if I'd say I hate the scale, but you have to love objective data, and at the same time, understand the limitations of that data. So obviously there's a lot of limitations to BMI. That's why the definitions of obesity are often changing to % of body fat, or you're looking at % of visceral body fat. Is it 1%? Is it 2%? And I think that things are going in the right direction, but there's also just not a large enough supply of these better ways of assessing body composition, like DEXA scans, than there is for the demand of it.
Yeah, so you often say, there's a time to love the scale and a time to hate the scale. When are those times?
Yeah, a time to hate the scale is when you are basing a health decision and making a decision that is bad for your health. It is going to lead to poor health because of a number on the scale. An example of this is, let's say someone starts taking creatine. They notice that for every half pound of creatine stored that they build up in their muscle, maybe they do a loading phase, but a lot of water is going to follow it. Or maybe they don't hydrate and they don't consume enough electrolytes. They consume more salt and other electrolytes, and water follows that as well. Or perhaps they're specifically trying to find a number on the scale, and they load up with glycogen for whatever reason. Maybe they're keto and now they're not keto. And then for every, half pound of glycogen, you're going to have 2.5 pounds of water follow that. So then they might make a decision just based on that increasing number on the scale that hurts their health in the long run.
Interesting. Well, with this, do you recommend that people don't make knee-jerk reactions in general to the scale? Because I think that happens a lot, right?
Yes.
It's like independent of any variable that's added in. You mentioned creatine being added in. I mean, to you and I that are versed in this, like that's a clear variable where I would expect see a little jump on the scale and I wouldn't panic. But independent of any of that, like if someone could be on a great weight loss trajectory, but wake up tomorrow morning and be up 3 pounds and then have a knee-jerk reaction where they crank it down.
Yeah, that is very common. It's normal to have a stepwise progression. There's a few ways to account for this. One way is to weigh yourself less often. One way is to use a different method to track, like DEXA scans. One way is to, yes, weigh yourself every day, but average them over the course of like 1 or even 2 weeks. So there's a lot of strategies that you can use, but at the end of the day, going into it, just know that one number on a scale over 1 day should have, unless I guess if you're a wrestler or a bodybuilder or you're trying to cut weight or something, then it shouldn't have any concern to you.
Interesting. So coming back to sort of this exercise versus fasting versus not, I'm assuming they were kind of adjusting for energy expenditure and everything like that. So it was kind of comparing apples to apples to apples, just under different situations, right? So it's like I'm not well versed with this particular study. So the people that were fasting, they were still consuming the same amount of calories, or I mean, everything was matched, energy expenditure, or were there variables there?
I don't believe that their calories were strictly matched, especially for the exercise group. If you look at individuals who are trying to lose weight that exercise often, especially runners, I know we're both runners before we kind of got into other things, but especially for runners, they tend to over-consume calories, especially liquid calories, and oddly enough, especially liquid calories from alcohol. But and there might be many reasons for that as well, but the calories were not matched, so you would expect if you exercised more and had a shorter feeding window that you would lose more weight, but there's just so many compensatory mechanisms to increase hunger and find like foods of high caloric density or eat faster, that those are accounted for.
That would make sense. And then, I mean, with this though, there wasn't an overlay, right? So like, I look at exercise and I could probably count on one hand the number of people, and I've talked to probably hundreds of people that have gone on a weight loss journey where they implement exercise and exercise only. Mm-hmm. Like usually it's going hand in hand with something else when there's a lifestyle change. I'd be hard pressed in the last couple of years to think of one person that says, I'm just gonna start exercising and not change my eating habits too.
Yes.
So when I look at that data, I'm like, I don't know if that is entirely like a real life situation. Like, but to your point, sometimes when people start exercising, okay, I notice this, I do some work with the CrossFit community. I noticed with CrossFit, I was talking to one of the former leaders there, and it was interesting because I told them, I said, hey, I look at a lot of these CrossFitters, and like outside of the elite level, a lot of them don't look too fit. Like their body composition, he's like, I've got a very solid answer as being in this for a very long time. He's like, you get into this point where they start this very intense exercise and they're getting 20-minute workouts, but they're like going balls to the wall and really just jamming their heart rate up, and they're just getting crazy and they do have good results in the beginning. He's like, but then eventually you're talking 20-minute workouts of high intensity, and they're like, oh great, well I can slam 2 pizzas. I mean, just the diet changes, and especially when you're looking at like very short workouts, which is a lot of times what people start out doing because it's all they can do. And they throttle it way too hard with a lot more intensity, and then again, just the response to want to overeat after that. I can absolutely relate to that. Like when I started doing CrossFit style stuff, I had to really keep my calories in check. I was like, whoa, like the appetite's unreal throughout the course of the day. And I feel like that's why, in my humble opinion, and I know you don't fast and I fast, and but we both agree that it works well for a lot of people. I find that, for me, a very black and white situation of just abstaining from food in tandem with exercise gives me this sort of barrier. It's like this subconscious, like, hey, like, or I guess it's very conscious, like you cannot eat during this window. So even if I am overdoing it on my training, it's a lot more difficult to rebound, because even as someone that's a trained individual and used to this, the desire to overeat after intense exercise still remains. I don't think that goes away whether you're trained or not.
Yeah, I think the debate between more high intensity training and low intensity training like LISS is interesting, because ideally you incorporate both of them. They're going to have different benefits, and doing a combination of both of them is also going to decrease your risk of injury or overtraining or fatigue, although overtraining is very rare. But another thing that I notice, I suppose not as much with the CrossFit community, but also with runners, is that they also tend to kind of have, I don't know if I'd call it like exercise anorexia, but it's this concept of like rewarding a good workout with more food or like a special food. And that I think that has some potentially negative consequences for like not their relationship with food, but how they view food as nutrition or pleasure. It's totally fine to pleasure eat, but it should be like within the context of you're not doing that because you exercised, or you're not like binging because you exercise, but you're just doing both because you have learned to like it and you're in the habit of it.
Very solid. And when you look at a trained individual, the delta between a good workout and a bad workout in terms of calories is probably minuscule,
Yes.
right? If I have a good run, if I go out and I run 8 miles and I knock it out in an hour, maybe I burn 750 calories. If I ran 7 miles and I did it in an hour and 5 minutes, I probably burned 740 calories. So it's not able to warrant an entire cheese pizza. So from a pure thermodynamic standpoint, it doesn't make sense. But I know you're talking to more of the, the relationship with food, which is a different tangent for a different day. However, like us both having young children, it's very difficult to not reward with food sometimes, right?
Yep.
But then you also have to think from an evolutionary standpoint, like food, I think it's okay to see food as a reward to a certain point, as long as that's in the right ecosystem, right? Like I don't think it's a problem. Like with me, with fasting, I would be lying if I didn't say that at the end of a fast, eating some food is a reward, right? Like I don't sit there in the 20th hour of a 21-hour fast saying, dang it, I have to eat. Like I don't even want to eat. Sometimes I do, but most of the time it's like, yeah, I get to eat. This is gonna be great.
It might be glass half empty versus glass half full, where if someone doesn't exercise, it's purgative, or they're punishing themselves because of it.
That makes sense. That's a very good way to put it, because I'm not gonna lie, like we took, we went to the Big Island. My son at the time was 4 years old. He cranked out an 8-mile hike at 4 years old.
Yeah.
And I was like, hey, Tommy, there's this thing called a milkshake, and you earned it. And some people will be like, I can't believe you introduced your kid to a milkshake. Like at the same time, I'm like, this kid just like first of all, he deserves it. He also deserves to be a kid. Yep. And I feel like that's a perfect example of like, hey, no, you. And I also made sure I was teaching him like, hey, like you burned a lot of fuel. You need to like, yes, we're going to replenish that with good food, but also like you did a damn good job. And there's something you need to try. It's called a milkshake. Yeah. But with that, I want to keep coming with respect to the fasting piece. I mean, do you see, like, outside of just weight loss, benefits of fasting that might be there that are not there with exercise, and vice versa?
I think there is a fasting regimen that is kind of in between time-restricted eating and what the current fasting mimicking diet protocols are, or FMD. That is going to be beneficial in humans for fatty liver disease. We know that a fasting mimicking diet can be very beneficial for mice in fatty liver disease. But the protocol that's used in humans is usually like a week of a very low calorie diet with very specific foods, and it's like borderline inhumane actually. But that being said, for most people with fatty liver disease, and it's a very common pathology in this country, we don't recommend it. Probably partly because we haven't found that good regimen. So hopefully over future study we'll find this, but that is certainly a huge health benefit that fasting can have over exercise. And perhaps not just for fatty liver disease. The liver, of course, being in the abdominal or peritoneal cavity, and your visceral body fat is the other amount of body fat in that area, likely for that as well. There's several other health benefits. For example, in some cases of neoplasms or cancers, and they can be beneficial, along with like macronutrient changes, but those are usually niche.
Got it. Yeah, and it's, I think, a piece that people often don't think about as well, which is becoming much more prevalent now with people talking more about early time restricted feeding, is, you know, these circadian clock genes and sort of the molecular clocks that our cells have. And that's going to happen, you know, outside of weight loss anyway.
Yep.
That's kind of these huge benefits here. Now there's exocrines and all this stuff that kind of come into play that can affect our clocks too, with exercise and exercise timing, which is a really interesting science. If you haven't gone down that rabbit hole yet, I'm sure you have. But and that can certainly influence cell behavior at different times of the day. But the evidence is quite strong in showing that, yeah, the time in which we eat does determine how our cells function too. And how does that play a role with weight loss, right? I mean, if you're aligning circadian cues with environmental cues a little bit better, and you start sleeping better, make better food decisions, you're more active, you have more energy. So there's all these pieces where, even though academia is looking at this and saying, okay, well, maybe it's all the same.
Yep. There is a good rule of thumb that almost everyone can apply, and that's not eating within at least 1 hour, if not 2, of going to bed. So often social factors will determine, like, 1, when you exercise, and 2, when you eat, but just finding what is like the most optimal regimen that's realistic with your life. Yeah. So, you know, if you're doing night shifts in the hospital all the time, that's obviously going to be very different, and you just do the best that you can do, not only for diet, but exercise and sleep as well. And then another piece of that, as you mentioned, is the benefit, or like the ideal candidate for fasting is going to be different, not only based on age or habits, but also body composition. So some people are, there's these terms that people have too much fat, or like they have too much adiposity, and they're under muscled. But that being said, if you look at people who are very, very obese, they actually have very high lean body masses. So those individuals could be better candidates for fasting. Where if there is someone who is truly skinny fat, so let's just say they have a very low lean body mass, but still a relatively high body fat percentage, then that individual might not be as good of a candidate if it is going to be one of the rate limiting steps for things like protein intake, or intaking enough calories around the time of exercise.
Yeah, that's exactly in line with what I've talked about. I've even done videos on that, where people that are skinny fat, depending on how much lean body mass you have, you can be mildly skinny fat and have some, maybe some shoulder muscles on you. But the bottom line is that I don't think that a regular intermittent fasting schedule is best for that type of person. I usually say, if you're really hell-bent on fasting at that rate, it's like every 2 weeks do a 24-hour fast or something like that. But for the most part, yeah, keeping those calories from protein are going to be very, very important. And that's a big problem that you end up facing with fasting in the first place is, let's be very blank here, is that people that lose weight with fasting, there are different factors, but at the end of the day, they're restricting calories, and that's probably the biggest, not the only, but the biggest driving force behind it. And when you look at that, there usually are issues with what they are taking in during their eating window. Like, I've looked at hundreds, if not thousands, of people's different diets with intermittent fasting, and like with that, yeah, the nutrient density of the foods that they're eating, the protein amount of the foods that they're eating, and candidly, the amount of calories they're eating are usually quite alarming. Like, okay, something needs to change here. You've got this loud minority of people that say, well, I do it right. I calculate my protein, I calculate this. Okay, well, that's not the masses. That's not, Bob and June watching this video right now, learning to intermittent fast and understanding, and that's usually the rule that I say is like, okay, you still need to take these factors into place. But if your goal is just simple weight loss, all of the above is the most important. Exercise, maybe a little bit of fasting or time restricted eating, not eating before bed, you name it.
By the way, even doctors and dietitians underestimate the calories they consume by 10% when trying to strictly track, and overestimate the calories they burn through exercise. So I think that it's good to remember that even someone who is trained well to do this can inaccurately estimate and that just makes it more important to eventually learn strategies to intuitively eat where you don't have to track things like calories indefinitely. I have various prescription pads, which I am converting into electronic form currently, but I circle various things. And on the nutrition one, on the exercise one, of course, I have resistance training, steady state cardio, NEAT, etc. And then on the nutrition or diet one, I have 7 different things, and the like number of meals per day is one of them. Eating speed is another one. Calories is another one. But you have all these different tools. This is, fasting or time restricted feeding is just one good tool that is applicable in many people that you should think about, but not necessarily put all your eggs in that one basket and ignore like all the 6 other tools that can be very helpful for body composition and weight loss.
Yeah, no, it's not it's a timing tracking system, not a calorie tracking system, and that aligns with all these other factors that we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. Now, with fasting versus exercise here, like I want to touch on autophagy for just a second. We're not going to go dense, and for those that are kind of newer to this topic, autophagy, to put it in a very simple way, it's sort of a cellular recycling, and kind of, if you want to call it that, where when you're fasting, various organelles and components of cells are sort of utilized as fuel for various components of protein and whatnot. That's a very simple way of putting it. But for those that are seasoned with it, autophagy, yes, it increases when you fast. Autophagy increases when you're in a caloric deficit, but autophagy increases dramatically more when you are exercising. And that's not to say that the autophagy and lipophagy and all that you get from fasting is bad. That's still a bonus, don't get me wrong. But I think I did this, Dr. Tommy Wood. I had Dr. Tommy Wood on my channel talking. We did a kind of a deep dive in this, and it was quite interesting to find out that exercise is probably the biggest driver of autophagy above anything else, even caloric deficit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of time spent trying to figure out which molecule or potential drug can drive autophagy. I myself spent time pipetting and doing flow cytometry, trying to figure out different molecules with this. But at the end of the day, it's just like everything else. Your lifestyle modifications, like exercise or diet, are going to be much more powerful than any medication or supplement. Much of that research is done for cancer prevention or cancer treatment, by the way. And yes, that's part of why with my 7 pillars of health, which is just the lifestyle interventions that are more powerful than medications and supplements, diet and exercise are number 1 and number 2. There are other things that you should consider when you're considering why are you desiring more autophagy? Is it just cancer risk? Is it cell turnover? Are you worried about just a literally fast growth rate? So there's something called cell checkpoints or cell senescence as well. And if you're not having enough of these checkpoints, sometimes I make the analogy, it's like a toll booth. And as your cells are going through the toll booth, which is partly due to your immune system, but also partly due to just metabolic activity, you're spending your fuel. You spend your fuel so your car slows down so that you can actually give it a good look over at the checkpoint. So there are reasons other than cancer prevention why you want your immune system and your just every cell in your body to have a good look over as it ages.
Interesting. Yeah, and I think that autophagy, although a very interesting and sexy concept, is not the same thing that people that are seeking weight loss think it is. There are elements of autophagy. There's something called lipophagy, which definitely can increase with fasting, and that's sort of utilization of fats through this process, which is relatively newer stuff. It's kind of interesting. There is one thing for people that are trying to get, potentially the best fasting for autophagy. I think it was a relatively recent paper. ETRF does seem to elevate LC3RA or LC3A as well as BCLIN1 quite a bit more than traditional fasting, or going like a 16-8, which again, it might just have something to do with better circadian cues and ultimately sleeping better. So it's which came first, the chicken or the egg with that? Are they living a healthier lifestyle because they're sleeping better?
Yeah, probably going to be one of optimizing your sleep regardless.
Yeah,
that's the 3rd pillar. But yeah, that's definitely an interesting topic and study to look into. And I do think that as time progresses, there will be more good evidence about in certain situations, this time window for feeding is best, or in certain situations, like these dietary modifications are best. But a lot of the debate about, it's almost like a dichotomy of people who are pro-fasting and anti-fasting, and you have to pick a camp and you have to be in one of them. But at the end of the day, you're still going to make the exact same lifestyle modifications, and hopefully also talk to your physician and or health coach or dietitian about other supplements or medications that can be tools to achieve those goals.
And momentum is a factor too. Momentum, fasting for a lot of people is very easy, and they lose weight relatively quick, and that gives them momentum to make different lifestyle changes. I know with my content being a lot of fasting content, I know that I'm a gateway for lots of obese people that have changed their lives because fasting worked for them. Doesn't mean fasting's magic, okay? But it does for people like myself whose brain works that way. It works tremendously well because it opens up Pandora's box of all these different things that you can now do. And I think teaching the basics of insulin and how insulin functions and fasting is just a very clear black and white discussion with that in many ways, just to be able to explain how insulin and food interact. I think it's very, very important. And before we kind of wrap up this video, because this will be a good direction to go, let's talk insulin for just a second, right? Because fasting and insulin, they go hand in hand. Obviously, we think about our fasting insulin levels. We think about insulin levels being low when we fast. But there's also sort of an improper demonization of insulin that I think that because insulin impedes lipolysis in certain ways, that it's automatically bad, and that high insulin is bad, so all insulin is bad. But it's also one of the most, I would almost say it might even be the most important hormone to me. Like I think so, at least. Can you just kind of debunk that a little bit?
Yeah. So insulin, of course, is a peptide hormone. One of the first peptides, it was probably 100 years ago that we were doing animal studies and realized that it cured animals that had type 1 diabetes. So within months, we were injecting it into humans because it saved their life. So that's an extremely fast, I don't even know if they had like different stages of clinical trials at that point. But yeah, that's why it's my favorite peptide. That's all a peptide is just a chain of amino acids. But insulin is also a very anabolic amino acid. It has insulin receptor, and insulin has a very fast half-life, but the downstream effects of it last a long time. For example, when it binds the insulin receptor in the liver, it's going to decrease SHBG, or sex hormone binding globulin, which can increase free androgens like free testosterone, which can be both good and bad. And then it'll also increase the synthesis of IGF-1, especially combined with high levels of growth hormone. So when that happens, IGF-1, of course, has a lot of downstream effects on many areas of the body, but cell growth, cell turnover, lipolysis as well. So there is a happy medium insulin where you have enough tone of your insulin to have, for example, an optimal IGF-1 level. So you don't necessarily want it too low, but for most people in this country, and fasting insulin is going to be too high. So I try not to like overemphasize the optimization of insulin. Of course, bodybuilders take insulin because it helps them build muscle. It builds lean body mass and non-lean body mass. But for your average individual, a lower fasting insulin is usually going to be better.
Yeah, that doesn't mean you have to be afraid of everything that spikes your insulin. It's it's at the end of the day, if your glucose is spiking and it's coming back down, everything is doing what it's supposed to do within given reason. That means insulin's doing its job. So at the end of the day, there is no real solid answer. Is fasting better than exercise? Is neither better than doing nothing? I think at the end of the day, it's roping it all together. So as always, Kyle, where can everyone find you, man?
They can find me on Instagram, Kyle Gillett MD, all other platforms, Gillett Health.
Right on. See you tomorrow.